Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I should really say good morning, friends. Many of you have been in this pavilion multiple times, and it's wonderful to see you again for one last time. On behalf of the Clean Air Task Force, I'd like to welcome you to the Zero Carbon Future Pavilion. My name is Steve Brick, and I'm a member of the senior leadership team at CATF. I want to express our happiness to having you here, and I want to especially bring you greetings from Lily O'Darno, who is the leader of our Africa team. Lily had to go back home. She was not able to stay until the last dog was hung at COP, and so I am here as a poor substitute. And I want you to know that, we've started a lot of sessions where, we seem a little sparse in the audience, but as people start talking, people will filter in, so don't give up hope. Just draw your attention to the QR codes on the wall. That will take you to a website that will do simultaneous translation for you if you should need that in many, many different languages. And last but not least, all of your microphones are on, so you don't need to do any flicking of switches. You just need to give a tick for Kyle to be able to change the device, I guess is what I want to say. I can't come up with the technical term. And so with that, again, welcome. So delighted to have you here. And I will turn it over to my friend Grace from APRI to lead it off. And your choice, you go where you want. Oh, by the way, I should have said, this is being recorded. It's all on the record. And you'll have access to this recording in due time, I guess is what to say. So again, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that great introduction, and thank you all for being here. My name is Grace Bongo, and I hand the climate change program at APRI, Africa Policy Research Institute, a Berlin-based African-focused think tank that researches key policy issues affecting the African continent. So we are really delighted to have you here today. But before I get started, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the Clean Air Task Force. I would also like to really thank the speakers and panelists for making time on a Saturday to be here at 10. So thank you so much. I'll introduce you later, and to the participants that are here and those that will be joining us as well. So thank you. As Steve has said, this event will be recorded. And we might be able to provide you with a recording if you request for it. It will also be on the website, so you'll be able to get that as well. So this side event will focus on providing an overview of our adaptation work in West Africa, in Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal. And we'll aim to really draw lessons on local, national, and global climate policy actions to inform local, national, and global climate action based on the work that we've done. I will not get too much into the project because that's what Jakob will do in a few minutes. But before we get into the project itself, I would like to say that this work would not have been possible without the great contributions of our researchers in Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal. We have our Nigerian researcher here with us, but we are missing our Senegal researcher here with us, but we are missing our Nigerian and Ghana. So I would like to acknowledge them today. So Ibrahima C. from Senegal, Dr. Eloka Okeke from Nigeria, and Albert Ain from Ghana. This also was made possible by our partnership and partners in all these countries, as the Department of Climate Change, Ministry of Environment in Nigeria, the Ghana Climate Innovation Center. The director is here with us, along with Dramani, the Center for Climate Change and Development in Nigeria, and many, many local communities. So we would like to acknowledge them and thank them very much for the support they provided us during the 2-year period of the project. We are 5-10 minutes late, so at this juncture, I would like to introduce Professor Jakob Mulungete, who is Professor of Energy and Development Policy and Director of the MPA program at Department of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Public Policy at University College London. Jakob was very kind to agree to be the advisor of this project. He's also kindly agreed to do a synthesis report that captures the messages of all the 3 countries and massages it, of course, to the global context, touching on the IPPC report for vulnerable countries. So we are really delighted to have him here. We thought it's important to have an outsider giving the results a different eye and also bringing it together from a different perspective so we can draw all the messages and lessons. The synthesis report is not yet ready. We are putting a lot of effort and work into it, but we'll definitely let you know when it's ready, and it will be ready at least by mid-January, and it will be available on our websites. At this point, Jakob, I would like to welcome you to provide the presentation, and later we'll have the panel discussion, at which then I'll introduce to you a panel. So just hold on for a moment. You'll get to meet them very soon. Thank you.
It's been a very interesting journey. For me, it's been heavily educational. A lot of the work that I do is in energy systems, even though I have a deep interest in development. And of course, I work on broader climate issues, particularly as it relates to resilience. And so when the opportunity to work with the team came up, I took it as a moment where I would be a student of the colleagues that have been producing these excellent reports across 3 different countries in looking at locally led adaptation, which is an up-and-coming concept, and it should be. It's about time that this happens. So this is really a snapshot of what's been produced, and that's the kind of structure that I would follow. So, I mean, the overall objective of this program, or of this study, is to explore and identify the key narratives around and policy coherence around the locally led adaptation in Senegal, Nigeria, and Ghana. And I think, there is a distinction here between locally led and community adaptation. Locally led means providing or giving agency to local people who themselves are the ones who are affected, and therefore they are the ones who can pose the problems as well as provide the solutions. They know better than anyone. Whereas in a broader sense, community adaptation tends to have a much more of a top-down type of an approach. So it is a new way of looking at local adaptation. The second thing is, of course, to identify the enablers and opportunities for what could be a successful local adaptation in the 3 countries. What are the barriers associated with this, particularly the barriers, to conduct successful LLA in climate action and governance, and then to try and extract some lessons from the cases that we have that colleagues have worked on. But I thought I would make a start with just a few points to make in terms of the bigger picture of what's happening. As you all know, that the IPCC 6th assessment report has been published. So the 3 of them have come out successively between 2021 and 2022. And some of the big items in there are messages, as it were, is that greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. And so we are actually beginning to enter into this dangerous zone of breaching the 1.5 degrees, unless peaking happens before 2025, which doesn't look very likely. And therefore, adaptation is going to be absolutely crucial to ensure that communities build the resilience they need. Again, another thing that's come out is that there is little headroom for building new fossil fuel infrastructure. and rapid transformations across all systems will be needed. This is both at mitigation but also at adaptation levels. And the idea that we can look at mitigation separated from adaptation doesn't make a huge amount of sense, particularly when we are looking at the situation in Africa. Lifestyle changes and behaviors and so forth. This was also something which was quite the big message coming through, although this may not necessarily be as relevant to conditions in Africa. And finance has to be scaled up. I mean, this is the elephant in the room. Everyone is talking about it, but very little seems to be happening. We've heard about the $100 billion. We keep talking about this elusive $100 billion. But also when we look at it dissect it, what we also realize is that a lot of that the portion that has come through has been invested in mitigation. And we're looking at less than half of it is in adaptation. Not only to say that also a small proportion of it has actually come through to Africa. So that's a big crisis. I think a lot of people many of us are moving away from the 100 billion and thinking a different way of mobilizing finance, some of which could also be mobilizing domestic finance. The dependence on international finance is part of the problem that Africa seems to be having. To be able to do projects in Europe, you can actually mobilize mature domestic money, whereas the LDC countries and generally speaking in the global south, particularly in Africa, reliance on international finance is problematic. And that's also a very cautious part of the financing. And one of the other things that came out through the IPCC is the understanding the interconnections. And this is something which is also, we know that it also happens we've discussed it within the SDGs. But the IPCC also has recognized this interdependence between climate, ecosystems, and biodiversity and human societies. As you can see, I don't know, that's not very clear. What that shows is that risk can arise from this dynamic interaction between climate-related hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. And of course, the human system, ecosystems, and climate change interact, in very real ways. Greenhouse gas emissions, of course, causes climate impacts. That also has its own impact on ecosystems as well as human systems and so forth. So the interconnection is something to keep in mind. Now, when we drill into Africa, what we see is also, this is something extracted from Working Group 2 on adaptation, is that there are some 4 fundamental risks that are important to recognize. And this is in food production and crops, biodiversity, mortality and morbidity, and delayed action or sea level rise. And what we see is that as temperature rises, we're talking about global temperature rises above one degree, then we start entering into these, very dangerous territory. Now, when you look at the drill down and what does the 1.5 degree even mean for Africa, it means much higher temperatures. And therefore, the impact is that much more significant when it comes to Africa. So agricultural productivity, for example, since 1961 has reduced by a pretty significant proportion. Some of it, a lot of it is climate related. Some of it is also the way, the actual impact on land itself. Biodiversity loss is projected to be widespread, escalating with every 0.5 degree increase. So we are looking at and mortality and morbidity, and a lot of the kind of cases that were produced in this project actually cut across a lot of these impacts. So now going into West Africa, the climate has warmed as I was saying earlier, even more than the global average in the past few decades. So temperatures that we're looking at in West Africa are in the order of 1 to 3 degrees centigrade since the mid 70s. The highest increases being in the Sahara and the Sahel. We're also experiencing heat waves, which have become, days have become hotter and longer compared to the last 2 decades of the 20th century. And in some parts of West Africa as well, we're seeing wetter conditions since the 90s, and in some others, you're looking at the frequency of drought. So we are talking about a real kind of disruption that is beginning to happen in West Africa. The East Africa has similar issues, but in a different way. So what are the impacts? As you can see, the real impact on the ground is that maize and wheat yields have decreased on average between 5.8 and 2.3. Rainfall and river discharge have been extremely variable also in West Africa. And droughts and floods and heat waves have become permanent features of what's happening. So that takes us to the discussion around community solutions in adaptation. The idea that a top-down approach is going to deliver the type of change. We've seen it. I mean, of course, the top-down approach is important to lay out some of the policies and governance structures, but it's also important to bring communities involvement in solving their problems. So yes, climate change is a global commons problem, but the impacts are often local. And different communities will be affected differently, largely because that's driven by livelihoods strategies, but also by ecosystems, by what resources people have at their disposal. Yeah. So the solutions would need to be specific, locally specific, and community-driven. Must adhere to grassroots component of the adaptation question. And what this means also is that participation of all stakeholders is key to success. When we mean all stakeholders, we're talking about global level, national level, and local level, but with local level engagement taking the lead. And that's what essentially the locally led adaptation is about, which recognizes the value of local knowledge and expertise, ensuring that local actors on the front lines of climate change have equitable access to power and resources to build resilience, where local actors have decision-making power. When we talk about decision-making power, it's also decision-making over financing, where money is spent. That decision should not just be made at national level. So they have to have a stake in how resources would be mobilized and spent. So the research methodology for the 3 countries, how long do I have? I can rant on all day, A few minutes. Wow, okay. So the research methodology, extensive review of key policy frameworks in each country to help identify the gaps and challenges, but also mapping the NDCs and other national policy strategies and initiatives. And then, drilling down in terms of, consultations of stakeholders at different scales, national and local, and then, deep diving into the 3 case studies. So I'll run through these fairly rapidly. So I think many of you know the countries. I mean, we have Ghana, Senegal, and Nigeria. Ghana is a lower middle-income country, rich in natural resources, population approximately 31 million. But agriculture plays the significant role in terms of the share of GDP. Senegal is a country of that it's not a big country, it's a small country relative to Ghana. Agriculture, mining, and construction and tourism are the main areas where the economy works. Recently, gas has been discovered, so Senegal is in the process of developing gas for its economy. And it has a sizable amount of it. Now, the question is whether, I think, we all have this debate whether Senegal should extract gas for its for export, how much of that would be used for national development purposes. So these are questions that have continued to come up in the past few years. Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, the largest economy in Africa, the most dynamic economy as well. It's an oil-producing country. Of course, many people assume that Nigeria is just about oil, but it isn't. I mean, if you look at the oil sector itself, in terms of its contribution to GDP, is less than 10%. Even though, of course, it generates a lot of the income. So Nigeria is, it is a fairly diversified economy to speak of. I'm just going to run into. Given that we don't have a huge amount of time, into the local cases. So colleagues looked at organic shear processing in northern Ghana, specifically on Ghana. 3 cases: climate smart agricultural practices, community responses to coastal erosion. The idea here really is to use this LLA approach, locally led adaptation approach, as the lens to do the analysis of these cases. And the key thing here is endogenous knowledge. Some people use indigenous knowledge. I've put endogenous to mean that knowledge is not just found in a particular part, but it is a construction which is both indigenous as well as from outside. So it's important to recognize that. So we're looking at traditional farming or fishing practices on their own are unsustainable. We need, new knowledge also that would complement these without losing the importance of indigenous knowledge. So LLA was the entry point, and one of the items there is that robust adaptation framework focusing on agriculture, forestry, and fishery could actually create significant amount of jobs by improving practices. But the key lessons here was the importance of community-based approaches, particularly those involving women. Some of these, 2 of these projects were women-led, in building resilience and adapting to changing climate. The other aspect is that the 3 cases here were motivated by a sense of ownership, self-determination, and pride in taking action to address the impact of climate change. And again, the key issue here is also the importance of local knowledge and traditional practices, which are often neglected by mainstream knowledge institutions, if you will. How many? 5 minutes, okay, we'll manage. And the other aspect was also the LLA practices were most effective when they were flexible and adaptable. That a rigid approach doesn't quite work. It actually is intuitively the opposite of what the locally led adaptation should be doing. And now turn to Nigeria, another 3 cases. One is biogas production for forest conservation, fisheries and aquaculture, land degradation in southeastern Nigeria. Similar issues that should have been from the previous one. But the key lessons is the motivation for engagement here was the fear of losing homes and the need to sustain livelihoods, fight poverty and food security. Importance of integrating indigenous knowledge, again, came through these cases, the need to invest in stakeholder engagement, and the importance of building capacity. One of the things that also was quite prominent in a couple of these cases was that the synergy between mitigation and adaptation is very important. Now moving to Senegal, we're trying to bring this to a conclusion so we can have a discussion. 3 other cases, climate smart women farmers experience in Daga Birame, coastal erosion experience, and heat wave, and the health experience in Widu Tengoli. The key lessons here were, impacts of climate change on production systems, the importance of good coordination and synergy between institutions, academic and technical services, and communities, but also the co-benefits that come through, not just the direct benefits, but also the co-benefits of using the LLA approach. Finance and technical capacity was a problem. Now, there were specific recommendations, and I will conclude with this, is that firstly, devolving and developing climate governance and institutions at local level. So it's not just about practice itself, but also the governance and the policy is absolutely critical to ensure that there is the opportunity to scale up. And the second is supporting collaborations between knowledge, policy, and practice communities, which is something which also came through in all 9 cases that we looked at. Technical capacity development through locally embedded problem-solving institutions. In other words, that institutions should be what they teach or what they research should be relevant to local conditions. If any, and this is what we talk about, decolonizing knowledge. That idea that we should be using cases from Europe or from Asia while teaching Africans doesn't make any sense. So we have, we should really be talking about knowledge-solving institutions and ways of teaching and training. National and local preparedness for climate finance. This is what I was saying earlier. Expecting resources to come through internationally. We should continue that, but at the same time, also it's important to ensure that local and national unlocking resources is important. So I'll stop here so that we can discuss more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jakob. As I promised you, I'll now introduce the people on stage. Here for us, on my left, is Ruka Sanusi, who is Executive Director of Ghana Climate Innovation Center. Next to her is Dr. Ibrahim C., is Senior Climate Change Fellow at APRI and Senior Lecturer in the Department of Geography at the University of Dakar. And then we have the guy I saved from the bank, so we have a lot of money to talk about. Alfonso Somorin is Regional Principal Officer at the African Development Bank. And then, of course, we have Jakob. And on the seat next to Jakob is Indidibong, who is taking the seat for Director of Climate Change, Dr. Inibong Abio Awe, who was not able to be here with us today due to an urgent travel back to Nigeria. With that, we've a lot of food for thought from Jakob, but I would like to start with a very important topic that has been given quite a lot of prominence at COP, and with that, we go to Ibrahima, whose work in Senegal and more broadly from the African continent focuses a lot on adaptation and health. Ibrahima, you've done quite a lot of work in the project and specifically focusing on Senegal. Your adaptation work has a lot of focus on health. My question maybe to you is, based on what you've learned through the project and what Jakob has spoken to us today, what do you feel is the importance of health taking prominence at COP28 this year? And how do you think that is going to contribute to both adaptation and mitigation efforts in Senegal and beyond?
Okay, thank you, Grace. I would like to thank APRI for giving us the opportunity to share our experience in Senegal on locally led adaptation. And I work mainly in the topic on climate change and health. And what I would like to share as my field experience is that communities have knowledge in adaptation, and they have real capacity to adapt to climate change, but they need support from central government or local government in order to identify strategies well aligned with NDCs contribution nationally contribution determined. And I think in the field of health, we have some initiative developed by communities, but it is what I could like is to say spontaneous adaptation. It's not well organized adaptation because it's not led by government or the local territory authorities. And when we see the experience, what we could take is we have knowledge on adaptation in health. We have adaptation strategies developed by communities well aligned with the NDCs, but we have not access to capacity building and access to funding to improve well the practices developed at local area. And I think in this COP, it is a good opportunity to enhance adaptation, local adaptation in the area of health. And I think when we go back in the country, we could say that in COP now, the health is priority for climate action, and we need to see how to develop initiative like what we have, what we develop now with Save the Children, who support the Senegal country to develop a proposal submitted to the Green Fund, GCF, in order to have a fund to support resilience of health system in Senegal.
Thank you so much. I would just like to follow up on that. Maybe ask you what most surprised you when you did your research in Senegal, and maybe even to add another question. Beyond the capacity building, finance, and all that, what do you think the world is actually not paying attention to? What is the one thing you'd say that there is a huge blind spot, both from the policymakers in Africa, but also from the global level in Senegal when it comes to adaptation and health?
What surprised me is that the communities conduce adaptation strategies, but it's not accounted by the government at the central level. And I think we need to know now adaptation will be local. We could not achieve anything in the face of in the area of adaptation if we have not the communities with us. And I think it will be a good thing if the government or the person who have acting in climate change could integrate well the strategy, the adaptation strategy conducted by the communities in order to have more performance also, but more efficiency in the area of climate action in Senegal. And I think this is what surprised me when I conduct this research in Senegal. There is capacity, there is knowledge in adaptation, but it's not considered in the adaptation policies in central level.
Thank you very much. I'll turn to the gentleman next to you, the guy from the bank. The elephant in the room, of course, is climate finance, and more so, as Jakob highlighted, adaptation finance. We know that little is flowing, and we know that which is flowing is very inaccessible to many African countries. So what do you think can be done in terms of thinking outside of the box to be able to increase financing at the national level, at the local level, but also to take advantage of the financing within countries to make sure that it's actually used in a more sustainable and more effective way?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much, Jakob, for the presentation. I'll tell you a quick story. Some 13 years ago, I was in the middle of forest somewhere in Congo Basin doing my work, and then I had an interview on the phone, and the man on the other side was really quite impressed. And right there, he told me, "You are hired. Let's start finding a way to get you to move to Addis." And that man is Jakob here. And unfortunately, don't clap, unfortunately, before we could sort out the agreement, the bank came for me. So it was a question of, should I go with African climate policy and do policy work or research, or should I go with the money? So I went with the money. So Jakob, let me say this, you are like the best boss I never had. Thank you. No, look, it's really important, and thank you, APRI. I am really privileged to be here. I'm also a non-resident fellow of this Policy Research Institute. The conversation around finance it's both complex, but also very disheartening. And it's disheartening because we can believe the myth that there is no enough money, and that would be completely wrong. I don't think the question is whether there is adequacy of capital or not. The biggest challenge is the distribution of capital. How do we move capital from where it is most abundant to where it is most needed? And that is very critical. Not even between the North and the South. We're even talking in country. And I think we should look at adaptation differently in that context. I like the emphasis on the elephant being in the room here, being finance. I'll give you 3 propositions. The first one is that we need to redefine our notion of climate and development. We're still making the mistake of thinking of climate change and climate finance, and then looking at development and development finance. And we're not taking advantage of that interconnection. And that is to our disadvantage. Because the truth about it is that if you ask yourself, what is the currency of an adaptive society? It's basically access to basic services, economic livelihoods, social resilience. Those are the basic, and they're very qualitative. And if you also ask yourself, what are the currency, or what are the tenets of a developed society? It's the same thing. So it's very important to be able to see, and to the extent that we can look at everything we call development finance, and I'm not talking about from development banks only, even in-house, household level, we should see that integration. That integration is very important, because the advantage of that is that it can help us move a lot of finance into climate action. In fact, the truth about it is that there should never be anything called a climate change project. It should be climate-informed development projects. All projects must have elements of climate mainstreaming in them. We're not going to need to separate that. The second thing, it's largely around the fact that, again, there are cases where we will be able to provide financial services using financial institutions to reach the local people and support their decision-making processes. But more importantly also, there are going to be cases where we may not necessarily give money to people, but we can invest in things that facilitate the economic livelihood systems. So if I choose not to give you money, but I create market opportunity for you, I think at that point in time, it's still climate finance creating that space. If I choose not to give you money directly, but I invest in infrastructure that connect the production side to the consumption side, and that is still climate finance at work. So let's look at finance in terms of what finance does, as opposed to a quantum of money given to people. And the work that AFDB does is basically that facilitative modality, investment into things that can create opportunities for people. Now, there's always a question about, should it be grants, should it be loans? And I'll be like, look, that's not the conversation. If I spend money to create a market opportunity for you, and you see the long-term impact of that, you wouldn't have problem to borrow money. I rather prefer to use the grant instead of giving it to you, in some cases, not in all cases, to invest in things that can create multiple opportunities. Then your sources of finance are very diverse because you've created an economic system that puts value on what you do. And one of the biggest challenges in adaptation today is we haven't built that economic case for adaptation like we have done for mitigation. The third point, and I think for me this is very important, we need a new economic framing about adaptation. When you ask most people, they'll tell you adaptation costs. And I'm like, what if we change that to adaptation investment? It's very interesting that if you frame something to be an investment, the way you relate to it, the way you allocate power and agency to it may be different from what you frame as a cost. You're spending money anyway. Whether it costs an investment, it's going to take money out of you. But there's a power of framing that is able to aggregate your energy, your connection, your networks, the coordination, everything to push the agenda forward. And we're very big on seeing adaptation as an investment, as more than a cost. Last point, look, we've realized it, that adaptation will never compete with mitigation. If you put basket of projects together, a bunch of projects together into one basket, and you just make finance available, chances are that 9 out of 10 mitigation projects will get attention of the investment rather than adaptation. However, what if we can begin to integrate adaptation elements into mitigation projects? And I like the point that you raised, so that mitigation finance can achieve adaptation results. So when I think of energy, I don't just think of energy for the sake of assets. I'm thinking of energy to power to do solar irrigation and to be able to put agriculture in a place that would not be possible without irrigation. And that is achieving food security, that is achieving adaptation. So look, I'm not going to announce numbers. I'm not going to say we need this amount of money. We need to understand the framework and the philosophy that guides finance, and that helps us to be able to look at things differently. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've touched on a lot of questions, follow-up questions that I was going to ask you in terms of beyond ad cash, what else needs to be done? So that some of those things you've highlighted. In the room today is someone who is actually doing just that within the Ghana Climate Innovation Center. So to me, Ruka is doing some of that within the context of the Climate Innovation Center. And I was very, very impressed when we first spoke, because she said, yes, we would of course like to collaborate with you, but how do we measure success? My question is, have we had any impact of success in this project, and how has that sort of factored into the kind of work you're doing with entrepreneurship in Ghana and beyond?
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Grace. I just want to actually just thank Dr. Lufunsho for his remarks, because I really feel that a lot of what he says is really thought-provoking, and it's given me a lot of food for thought, and I might be borrowing some of what you've said when I'm having my further conversations, so thank you. But to go back to the question that Grace has raised, when I think about, I want to start with definitions first and foremost, because as well as asking you about how we measure success, one of the first things that came to my mind when we spoke at the commencement of this project was, what is locally led adaptation methods, right? Does that mean locally led, locally sort of like implemented? And does it mean that it was designed elsewhere at the Ministry of somewhere? Was it designed in Washington? Was it designed in Berlin, right? What are we actually trying to achieve when we say, locally led adaptation? And it just brought to my mind a couple of, about 2-3 years ago, an organization that's the Global Organization Research Institute based in DC, set up an email group for locally led adaptation strategies. And I was displeased by that. They invited me to be part of it because I really didn't understand why somebody that's based in DC wants to convene and lead the convening of locally led adaptation strategies all over, not just Africa, Latin America. And I still get their emails, but I ignore everything. But maybe I shouldn't, because after this project, I realized that perhaps what they actually wanted is what we've done with APRI in terms of to understand what is being done locally so that they can put money to it, perhaps. So maybe I missed out, but then APRI came along. So now when we think about Ghana, there are 13, under climate adaptation, but in the NDCs, there are 13 thematic areas. And the first question is, for climate adaptation, whether some of the successes that we found in this project and the methodologies that were adopted, the execution methodologies, the approach methodologies actually feature in those thematic areas. And I think it's important to state that, because the two successes that I'll just very briefly speak about, I think Jakob touched on them in his remarks. They're both in agriculture, right? So he spoke about the organic share farming, and then I think he spoke about another agriculture project that because we rely on rain-fed agriculture, and because of the things that Jakob said, droughts and floods and all of that, this organization adapted to using regenerative agricultural practices to conserve the need for water. Another one had similar problems, right? And they left whatever they were farming altogether and moved to organic, shea butter production. But more than that, they were able to support the sustainability of the new organic farming that they were doing with shea butter through a village savings and loan scheme. So one group said, this is working for us, but we have to use a different approach and methodology. Another person said, well, climate change we're going to just leave behind what it is that we were doing and work on something else. Now, their success actually brought visibility to them, because then local development institutions, people who are who have the finances, who have the clout, who can come to COP, who can go to APRI, they brought attention to themselves, to the extent that these organizations are now saying, okay, we like what you're doing. This is local intellectual capital, right? This is people locally, local communities saying, you know what, we have to help ourselves. It's actually a survival thing. It's not anything that is been drawn up by Ruka and her team. It's them saying, you know what, we've got children to feed, we've got school fees to pay, whatever, and we're going to, we need to survive. And for me, I think that's the beauty of a bottom-up approach. So it's locally led, locally informed, locally owned, locally everything. And somebody else says, you know what, this is working for you. Because behavior is very difficult to change. If Ruka and Dramani were to say this is what you need to do, that you have to change behavior and do it this way, believe me, it's likely to be unsustainable. So I think, Grace, to answer your question, success came for these people, these communities, really because they took ownership. They realized that climate change was impacting their livelihoods, and they themselves decided what they needed to do, and brought good visibility to themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we'll move to the lady on the other side of the panel, and Didier Dong, representing the Director of Climate Change in Nigeria. I think this, as we saw in Ghana and Senegal as well, was very important to work with the ministries for the uptake of the results that we are doing. And we've learned quite a lot working with the Department of Climate Change. And I'll turn to you Indiodong and ask, what is Nigeria doing well in respect to adaptation policy and implementation, and what can other countries and international community learn from the case of Nigeria?
Thank you so much, Dr. Grace. Thank you, everyone. And I also want to send the greetings from the Director, Department of Climate Change, Dr. Inyabon Abiola. Thank you so much. So for the ministry, I just want to take back to the department, like the mandate of the department. What is it all about? It's all about giving sustainable policy, bringing about sustainable policy to be able to give an enabling environment to carry out climate actions, in addition to adding up to greenhouse gas inventory, mitigation options, vulnerability assessment, and adaptation measures, all together bringing together the actions in climate change. And then for us in the department, there's so many divisions there, and then the adaptation and vulnerability department. And when we talk about this locally led, which, as you know, in collaboration with the Center for Climate Change and the African Policy Resource Institute, bringing this informed position for us to see what it's really happening. And you know, in the space, most time, like the department, there's so much engagement, so much stakeholders and engagement down to the, for instance, we have the interministerial engagement forum for the technical, and then we also have the ministers involved. And then now, in addition, we also cascade to the NGF, which is the Nigerian Governors Forum, and then looking down to the local government and all that, bringing all this together. What does it do to be able to drive informed decision and awareness of what is really happening, and then to also see that a lot is happening in the space. Just like Rukia said about the people being locally led about what they need to do to be able to see that, because at the end of the day, there must be an enabling environment for this to happen, and also policies that drive. And then for the ministry, there's a policy on national climate change risks and response and risk, and there's also the national adaptation policy for climate change and the national adaptation planning. So all these policies be able to define and also inform and also manage the long-term and the short-term processes that needs to be done. So in terms of the successes, I know that the ministry has been able to drive with the institutional arrangement that is also there, to be able to drive information and then go down to the community, and then be able to source and then be able to make out with what needs to be done. And then there's also the need for capacity. That's another aspect which needs to also be strengthening, and which, yes, it's being there, but there's also need for strengthening. And then there is another aspect of integrating those policies, you know, because whatever needs to be done, this having a stakeholders engagement, this things, all this engagement, at the end of the day, the actions that are being made, they needs to be integrated into policies. So that's another angle which needs to be enhanced at the same time. Those things are being done there, but then it still needs to be enhanced. And then there's also the need for talking about the policy as well, which I think that's more or less what needs to be really, really outlined, which the ministry has already been key to driving the policies of adaptation. So I don't know if that's okay there.
Thank you so much. I mean, Nigeria has done quite well in integrating its NDC. So part of that, as when I went to the Nigerian pavilion and said, so what is your ask? And she said, we need financing. We need financing to be able to drive the process.
We need investment, right? It's not financing. You need investment.
Thank you. I'm just using our words, but now we call it investment. Thank you so much. Jakob, I'll turn to you. You've been in this space for quite some time, and you've been able to look from a different eye the work that the researchers have been doing in Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal. From what you've seen, what elements can be picked up to enhance and sustain adaptation action at the local, national, and global levels? And how can we tie adaptation action more so to mitigation and vis-a-vis mitigation adaptation and all that needs to happen, of course, with the objective of sustained social and economic development and well-being?
Thanks. Thank you, Grace. I mean, one thing I would say is perhaps to look at, as Olu said, not to separate. We know that discussions happen on mitigation and adaptation, but rather to find a way or to think in terms of development and resilience rather than adaptation and mitigation. I think we do need to find a connection with them, because what you do in mitigation helps in adaptation, and what happens in adaptation, the same thing. You can give me any project, you will always find those connections, whether it's in water systems or energy or health and so forth. I don't see those disconnections. So it's important to think in an interconnected way. The second thing I would say is, I think, when it comes to locally led adaptation, is to take participation and the agency of local people seriously. Because if we don't, then it will inevitably be an imposed type of a solution. The problem has to be generated from within, but also the solutions have to come from by ensuring that people are sufficiently empowered, whether it's financial, but also, so the role of the outsider should always be as a support, not one who actually owns the knowledge or the pathway forward. It means then that there needs to be a great deal of thinking in terms of solidarity. Now, in order to be able to do that, you need to have humility, that you don't know what is going on at the local level. Your role has to be that of a supporter, and not one that sets the agenda. So the agenda has to be set at the local level. I think those are the things to highlight. I mean, I'll just leave you with a concept. This is what's known as praxis in education, where you have reflection and action. Reflection is not so much just about yourself, but understanding your context, but understanding your wider context. And I think this needs to happen. If once you understand your the wider context, for instance, where Olu sits, on the money, understand his constraints as well. Then it is possible to be able to act collectively and together. So I think those are the points I wanted to raise. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're coming to the close of our time, but I still want to give you an opportunity to actually respond to this last question as your closing word, the entire panel, each at a time. And I'll start with you, Ruka. Collaboration and dialogue is very important if we are to move forward, to, of course, understand the context that you, Jakob, has mentioned. We are working different forums here, in government, in research, in the bank, and and in other areas. So my question to you is maybe to reflect, and maybe before I actually do that, I would like to ask whether the audience has one or two questions before we close. Very quickly, just one question, please. But you can reflect on that question on collaboration and dialogue.
Thank you very much. I am Mahmoud Ibrahim Mahmoud from Nigeria. And so I would like, my question has a spectrum, and it will touch on Olu, it will touch on Yakub, and then DCC in a way. So for Olu, you talked about the financing, but I was looking at the horizon that is coming up in first quarter of 2024, where AFDB has announced that there is an African climate financing and a platform that is coming. What can you say about that? Whereas for Yakub, you discussed a whole length of topics where there is a pot of funds. However, part of the challenge where the distribution Olu was talking about is not making it happen is because when you have proposals, the quality of proposals, the capacity of proposals for Africans to really tap into that pot, even if it's a scoop, it's really a challenge where many a times Africans are not able to get this financing because of the capacity to develop a bankable or fundable proposal. And now for DCC, my ask is that you've talked about policy engagement. Can you speak, and in what percentage, around the coherency of the policies that Nigeria has been able to put in place to address some of the issues on climate change? Thank you.
We're in trouble.
Thank you. My name is Abdullahi from Nigeria. So my question is to you, Dr. Olufonso. So how do we truly put up the necessary mechanism to mobilize local resources within our country locally for climate-related projects? How do we really do that? Because I believe AFDB should be able to lead in that aspect, because truly there's no funding coming on from the global north. The conditions are very stringent. So how do we truly put up the right mechanism to be able to source for local funding from our own countries in the global south? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the great question. So we start.
Okay. Thank you so much for that exciting question about the policy. So I'll start from the National Adaptation Policy Action on Climate Change, and that's 2011 policy that was made and then was revised again into the National Climate Change Response Strategy and Response Policy. So you see that there is a coherence, there is a coordination into what needs to be done. It doesn't stop there, but then again, it has to be revised. And then all other things, actions that are being carried out are also needs to be outlined. And also there's also making sure that these are showing the framework and then the roadmap that needs to be carried out. And at the same time, there's also managing the long-term and the short-term processes that needs to be done. So there is the process of this coordination and there is the process of this coherence in carrying out actions that needs to be done. So I do not know if that question has been answered.
Thank you for that question. A few years ago, I was involved in a project looking at agro-industries, the way in which agro-industries can support energy access. Agro-industries have capacity to some extent. They are within the formal sector, therefore they are able to access money from banks and so forth. How can we use those to be able to for them to be anchor to communities around them, so that the energy access question is not fragmented. Yeah. And one of the things that we struggled with was when we went to the projects, in other words, to the agro industries themselves, whether sugar or tea or whatever, they would say, we don't have the capacity. The guys at the bank or elsewhere, their requirements for project development is beyond what we are able to offer. And then we went to we didn't go to this bank, but other banks, yeah, and they said, well, we don't. We said, look, it's a no-brainer. It seems like these are the types of things that you should be doing, because a lot of people are actually around these agro industries, and it would be the best way to try and electrify rural communities. And they said, well, we don't really get projects like that. So you clearly have a gap there between the supply and the demand. And the role that we wanted to play in that project was to create, to support, those entities to be able to develop, bankable projects. So I think there is a gap there that needs to be filled. I don't know how that can be done. I think it depends, from one country to another. It may be that, rural development institutions themselves might be able to do that. It may be some, knowledge institutions might be able to support. But I do think that there is a massive gap, between what the demand is on the ground with the supply. I think both sides are somewhat, not really finding that middle ground. I think, that's the problem that I see.
Thank you. So I want to start with your question, and I thought it was a very brilliant question and very specific as well. Look, from where I stand, once we get to that point where we are able to make that business case and we see the development value of whatever we call climate action, what I think is very important is for us to find a mechanism, and the key word mechanism, financial mechanism, where we turn dormant capital in our country into productive capital. You'll be shocked to know how much is in the Nigerian pension fund alone. But then this is a pension fund that is trying to look for money, businesses, and is doing fixed income, abroad for 6%. What if we're able to create a mechanism, aggregate, for instance, smallholder farmers, aggregate about 200,000 or 1 million smallholder farmers who already have part of their contribution, and we can turn that dormant capital in the pension fund, or dormant in a way, into an investment. But again, it's very important to be able to get market at the end. And I'll tell you this, if you ask a farmer, the biggest opportunity for them is a structured market. If there is if they know that there is a continuous demand for their product and there is a good price for their product, they will increase labor. They will look for every means possible to access capital to do that. If there is no assurance of that at the end of the production line, it's going to create chaos for them. But then that's the power of aggregation. So one of the missing points, a missing link in many of our African countries is we don't have a central union type of organization. So a farmers' union that is very big on using its leverage to be able to tap into capital or even treasury. We'll call something SS crude account. Now we've finished it. Remember, so when we had it, what if we had about a group of 1 million farmers saying, look, we're able to pay a return of 5% on this by giving it to individual farmer. In Kenya, I live in Kenya, and I can tell you this. There's something called the cooperatives, SACCO. SACCO in Kenya has about capital base of about $14 billion in total. And they are able to provide capital to a number of people who are able to be part of the global value chains. And that is turning that capital base that would have been sitting there waiting for fixed interest rate in commercial bank into providing capital. So we're not even talking about going abroad. We're talking about in country. We need to be able to create that financial mechanism. Now, how do we touch on this? And I know we're running out of time. And I like the example that you gave of special zones. AFDB has spent, together with Islamic Development Bank, we spent billions of dollars in Nigeria investing in special zones. But you see, if we cannot aggregate farmers to produce and support those zones, unfortunately, it's going to be a bad project. And that is the power of organization. Look, sometimes I've reached a point in my life, I say, maybe the best thing you can do for me is not to give me money, but it's to show me the way. So if you have to spend your money to facilitate the environment for me to thrive, to succeed, then you may have done better than giving me money. And we have to look at finance in terms of what it has the ability to unlock, as opposed to what is given directly to you. I don't know if that makes sense. We can take this forward after.
Thank you so much. Ruka has something to add as well. So
I really appreciate the question very much as well. And I was going to even talk about the need to, connect with mission and values aligned capital. But I like Olu's point more around dormant capital, because whether or not we get financing from the north, climate change is still negatively impacting our societies and our economies, right? So we're going to have to be ingenious and really clever about how we use the resources that we have locally. He spoke about pension funds. For decades, we've been talking in Ghana about how local funds should be financing climate entrepreneurship. They were not interested. It was a case of, these are people's pensions. We don't play with it. We put it in sovereign bonds and, all of those things. Well, well, you know what happened a couple of months ago last year? We had to restructure, domestic debt restructuring program, which means people couldn't even access, any interest on and maybe even some of the initial deposit from their sovereign bonds, right? So now we have pension funds now coming to us and saying, okay, what's all this climate entrepreneurship about? Is there a way in which we can actually invest in some of these entrepreneurs? So I think we all really have to be really clever and think that, I like the point about, okay, is it really money? Because we need money, but do we have to go to the GCF? Do we have to go to the GEF? Do we have to always be going to some money that will take you 10 years to even access, right? When we have money locally sitting there, right? But we have a very low risk appetite. In the meantime, the climate change is a risk to all of our survival. So a lot of really interesting things, and that's, I think that's all I actually need to say. I don't need to talk about collaboration or dialogue.
Thank you. We seem to have Akimeji. Just one. It's getting interesting as we end, but we really need to end in the next 5 minutes because we have to prepare for the next panel that is taking place here. So just one question, Akimeji, please.
Thank you very much. It's not a question, it's a comment, and I'll be very brief. I'm Akinyemi. I work with the state government, one of the states in Nigeria. So I'll start with a comment about locally led. For me, locally led is all about ownership. Whether it comes from America, comes from Britain, comes from Kenya, Somalia, wherever. So long as you can get the local people to own that process and drive it. Bottom up, it's locally led for me. The second thing, it's about, structure. In Nigeria, for example, we have the federal and the state governments. And with all due respect to Madam here, a lot of times engagement often happens at the federal. And everything, most times, stop there. You have adaptation plans, you have this policy, you have that policy, you have a lot of it. When you begin to ask in the states what's going on there, you find out that there's a lot of gap, happening in the state. So I think for global financing and investment companies, it's very important when you're designing programs, not only to engage with the federal government, but again, to start at the inception to engage with subnationals. You'll be surprised at the nimbleness and the ability to respond in some of the subnationals. I'll give an example of the SAPZ and the Ekiti Knowledge Zone in Ekiti State. From ideation to signing the deal, we completed it in about 1.5 to 2 years. And it is because of the commitment of the local actors that were involved in that process. They were very committed, very ready to move, very ready to deliver, and that's quite a feat. I'm sure the federal people know to have an ideation to signing the deal with the development bank in about 1.5 to 2 years while managing a political transition. It's quite a feat in Nigeria. I think the third one I would just touch on, it's not only about dormant capital, it's also about stranded capital. We have a lot of investment in real estate in Nigeria, and some of those houses are empty. So that is capital going to houses and buildings, empty buildings. What's happening to that? Is there a way to mobilize that capital also for productive enterprises within the country? If there's a way to do that, I'm not a finance guy.
Thank you so much. I will give, yes, I'll give you an opportunity.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. I think we talk more about fund, but I think that as we are also in seeing how to make up local-led adaptation, how to show the add value of locally-led adaptation for climate action, I think we need to develop more collaboration, like universities, technical agencies, and also NGOs and communities, in order to document experience from communities and to see the relevance and also the add value for climate action, because I think if we need to have fun, we need to show scientific evidence from local-led adaptation and how local-led adaptation can support climate governance in countries like Senegal, Ghana, and also Nigeria. And I think it is an important point.
Yes, please.
I've attended so many conferences and so many side events during this COP. And one thing is very particular about Africa. We need to just change this whole narrative. Forget about all these meetings. Look, let's face the issue. I like what you said, climate entrepreneurship. Let us identify the opportunities and work with the banks to put the structure for us to see. In Nigeria, you just mentioned, Professor, the service industry, 58%. We get more money from our musicians, our actors. I mean, they are even surpassing the oil and gas industry. Nigerians are entrepreneurs. Let us showcase the opportunities that exist within the climate space. And I can guarantee you, those funds you're talking about will come out. So I really want the African Policy Research Institute, the African Development Bank, to come up with a mechanism to bring those entrepreneurship out in Africa. And let's see what happens. I mean, I want us to end this engagement with something that is, forward-looking. I purposely came here today. I targeted this meeting because I wanted to speak about this issue. I believe the opportunities are there. I just came out from the Chinese pavilion. I could see what they are doing with climate entrepreneurship. Massive, in the billions and trillions of dollars. So why can't we do something like that in Africa and unlock these local resources that we're talking about? So I want you people to please do something about it. Let us put up a structure right here today to say, okay, look, AFDB, APRI is going to put up a structure to get this off the ground. This is what I want to hear. Please. Thank you.
Jakob, you have the last word. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I couldn't agree. I think I agree with you totally. Yeah, action oriented. But I have a question for Ibrahima. You've been involved in this work and you've produced some really wonderful cases. In the course of doing that, what were the things that you learned, and what were the things that surprised you? Were there anything that you found unique and new and inspiring?
Yes, I think. Yes, I think it's an important question. When I start the work with APRI, I see that at the university we don't know what is local-led adaptation. When I talk about this concept, they say, "What is this?" And we implement the first workshop, and I share the different experience that we have, and I say its difference can be considered by local-led adaptation. But we have not scientific evidence to say that, yes, we are in local-led adaptation. And then I think for recommendation, I think we need in African countries to make up communities adaptation strategies by documenting and by showing what is the relevance and for climate action. And I think at the University of Dakar, I developed slowly this kind of training to the students, and they know when they have to choose thematic for master. I think they could also integrate this kind of climate issues in our university, and I think it's a good point. Yeah.
I think we really have to continue this discussion somewhere else because we need to prepare the room for the next panel. But it's been a delight to have you here today, and I'm really looking forward to further conversations. I think I have the contact of most of you, and we'll be getting in touch. Abdullah here, am I saying that right? Yeah, okay, great. We'll be in touch with you to see how we can actually think through these processes together as well. Thank you so much. And again, my sincere thanks to Clean Air Task Force for hosting us today. And we'll see you soon in our next event. So thank you and have a nice morning.